Differences from conventional exit. And I suppose what we want the employee buyout to be seen as a conventional exit. But when I say conventional exit, what I'm usually talking about is a trade sale, a management buyout, family succession, or in a very rare occurrence in these days, a listing or something equivalent to that. Those are your sort of traditional ways of how do we deal with an exit. The control aspect is very noticeable. The only third parties that are usually involved is if there's a third party funder. So if you're borrowing money, but they're often not driving the transaction, albeit they might have an interest in seeing a secure succession. If it's a banking relationship, for example, you want to see how management succession is going to work as part of this process. Which means that when we're acting for a business, our client is often the company, and we're not acting for the owner, we're not acting for the employees, and our role is often to seek to find consensus amongst all the parties. Some of them may then choose to take their own independent advice at critical junctures in the transaction, but that control of timetable and what is said and when and what happens and when is something that people find very, very attractive. It does mean, though, that if you're an advisor working these transactions, they often take a bit longer. Because you haven't got that third party driving someone along, you sometimes find that, well, something came up this week, so I didn't have time to look at that, but it's only myself I'm inconveniencing, so I'm not so bothered about that. So that timing and control element does have a slight connection. A typical transaction for us is about 6 months. The legacy aspect, that's often a driver. Not always, but it's often a key factor tied up in what are the key elements in terms of why you're doing this. And it's one of the things that makes it often a real pleasure as an advisor working these transactions, because you want to make sure people are making the right decisions for commercial reasons, but there are other things mixed up in these transactions rather than just how can we maximize your cash or minimize your tax liability. Due diligence is usually limited, especially if those employees aren't putting any money in, then the owner to a large extent will dictate what will happen. And they're very light on the warranty standpoint, and it means that the due diligence exercise is very light, which has an impact in that part of a transaction, but it also means for an owner, it feels like a less intrusive process as well. You don't have somebody crawling over your books and asking a lot of challenging questions of your business, which can sometimes feel a little uncomfortable, actually, and downright unpleasant for some people. The post-transfer structure is often more important than the deal structure. The deal structure is absolutely critical, and you have to get that right, and unless you can get a deal structure with a price that will work for the owner, with a repayment schedule that will work for that owner, nothing happens. So you've got to deal with that as a upfront, as the first priority. But once you've dealt with those broad principles, you usually spend a lot more time working on what's it going to look like afterwards. And when you're working on a management buyout, that is in there as well. If you've got a group of management involved, you're usually looking at a shareholders agreement, set of articles, but it's usually a much bigger question because ownership has transferred, often to a trust-controlled model. So who controls that trust? Who makes what decisions within that business? Who appoints the board? And it just, structurally, it's quite fundamental questions about how this business should run going forwards. And often what you're doing is you've got to strike the balance between acknowledging the fact there's been a fundamental change, but while also reflecting the fact that one of the reasons people are often going through this transaction is because they want to retain their independence, because they feel they've got something really special already, and they don't want to lose that while going through this transition. An objective in a lot of this is often people say, well, what's the fair thing to do? Now, fair does not mean equal, and that's always something that people usually get very, very easily, but just to be reminded, that doesn't mean that everyone's suddenly all the same, that you've got 50 employees and they're all going to own 1/50th of the business and everyone's going to get paid the same, and it doesn't work like that. But one of the drivers when you're going through it and people are working out what decisions should sit where, that is one of the questions that sometimes comes up. What's the right thing to do for everyone as a whole? And the owner involvement, it is, I would say, in certainly the majority of these transactions we work on, the owner is involved for a significant period afterwards. And that's with the consent of everyone. It's not a case of they're being tied into, well, you've got to get your earn out, you've got to stay involved for the next couple of years. It's actually a much more consensus-based structure. Albeit the owner's usually got a commercial interest in being involved if they're still owed some money, that they want to see that the management team's running effectively and that the business is still making enough profit to service the debt that might well be getting paid to them. And you can structure these transactions in a way that the owner has to be involved for a period of time. You know, particularly if they're being owed cash, there can be strings for that repayment schedule, you know, which can be as simple as I'm on the board for as long as I want to be, or until you've paid me my money. But usually it's actually a very consensus-based element, and that's usually a comforting aspect for the employees, the fact that individual's not going to walk out the door the day after they sign the pieces of paper. But that's tied into the control aspect as well, and the fact that you work out what works for that organisation rather than it being driven by what some third party would want in, say, a trade sale situation.